This weekend, join Vision CEO Phil Edwards for Sunday Morning Together. Each week, Phil is joined by pastors from across Australia as they minister to us all. Communion, conversation, encouragement, and a smorgasbord of great songs help us focus on God's character and promises. Sunday Morning Together with Phil Edwards on Vision and on demand every Sunday in the free Vision Christian Media app. A biblical perspective on life, culture, and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're going to be talking about shame, and we all feel shame at times. Shame is that state of defeat that comes when we've been doing wrong or being filled with regret and sadness for our actions. But for some people, traumatic experiences impose deep shame that prevents personal growth and leads to all sorts of disruptive behaviours. We might be encouraged where the Christian gospel addresses shame. In Revelation chapter 3, the words of Jesus are, "I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, so you can become rich, and white clothes to wear, so you can cover your shameful nakedness, and salve to put on your eyes, so you can see." The power of shame over us largely depends on it being hidden and unacknowledged. So today we're looking to understand shame for ourselves and the debilitating effects on the people who are in the broader perspective of our lives. Two special guests joining us through this coming hour, Matthew C. Clarke and Isabella Rossini Clarke. They've written a book called Disrupting Mercy, The Gift of Extreme Kindness, Motivated by Compassion. Matthew is principal researcher for the Freedom Keys Research Project, focusing on prevention of human trafficking. And Isabella Rossini Clarke, or Bella, is founder of Turning Teardrops into Joy. Let me say a special welcome first to you, Bella.
Hi, Neil.
And to you, Matthew.
Lovely to be here.
Wonderful to have you. And Matthew, welcome to you.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Thanks for bringing us back. We mustn't have scared you or the listeners off too much when we talked about that book on mercy a few months ago. It's great to be back.
The only thing that's scary is that, wow, aren't these things deep that we can talk about when we talk about mercy? And sometimes we want just a simple definition, but I just appreciate so much the way the two of you are able to take things into the deep end for us. And certainly around what we're going to talk about today, shame. Sometimes we talk about guilt and shame. I wonder if we can start off here because, you know, for those of us who might be thinking, oh, I've heard about that shame and I've heard about, you know, God and the way that he deals with shame. I wonder if you've got any thoughts here, if we're just getting into a conversation, how we might understand what shame is and how it affects us. Let's go with you first, Matthew.
I want to just,
Bella,
before
Bella,
Matthew
that's
starts,
great.
a typical Bella thing, I would just like to paint a soft colour across the canvas of this conversation and encourage our listeners here that some of the things we may talk about may trigger some anxiety or some memories or some things that may be difficult. And I want to encourage those listeners to, if they can, to stay courageous and brave, but please note that it is okay to walk away from this conversation if it is too difficult, and there's certainly help that can be given because we're not counsellors at all. So I just wanted to paint that gently behind us, that these are sensitive issues, and because they are sensitive, we do need to bring them up into the light so we can become more comfortable with talking about our humanness. So I just wanted to paint that there for our listeners.
You know, I'm so thankful that you do that because some conversations can lead us into all sorts of things that trigger emotions and hurts and all sorts of things that can be dug up from our past. So thank you so much for that, Bella. So if we're talking about guilt and shame, let's just get into what we're talking about when we say those sorts of words.
Yes, they're both very common words that we use in psychological settings and legal settings and Christian moral settings. And so the common distinction that's made between guilt and shame is that guilt is about something that you do. If you find yourself saying, I shouldn't have done that, I was wrong to do that, then that's a sense of guilt. But when it becomes something that's more deeply personal and it reflects on who you are rather than what you did, then that becomes shame. So if you start thinking, oh, I'm useless, I'm helpless, I'm worthless, I'm always doing that, people should just give up on me, then there's a sense of shame lying within inside us there. So guilt is about breaking some rules that's an external law or something like that, whereas shame is this more deeply held personal moral feeling. Guilt is something that you can reason about. You can say, well, did I really break the law? Yes or no. You can cognitively talk yourself around it, around the contours of guilt. But shame is very difficult to reason about. You might know in your head that you have no reason to be ashamed, and nevertheless you feel this deep gut level horror at yourself, this worthlessness, this self-judgment. And it's that debilitating emotion that I think of as the core of shame.
And those triggers, Bella, sometimes those things are triggered because of our thoughts about how our parents raised us, or about how we were treated at school. And let me dare say, and even jumping into the deep end, even issues around church. But I guess there's shame all around us, and being able to identify that shame and know how to handle it, because even in the modern state of identity politics and the sort of controlling manipulation that you might be under because, people are trying to shame you into holding their position, no doubt this is something that's just huge. So those sorts of things, they come from everywhere, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the childhood one, let's just talk into that space a little bit, because I think I have been a child raised in a Christian house. I have been a parent who has raised my children through. And now I'm a grandparent, and I so wish I could have my time again. I would do things quite differently. But one of the things that I reflect back into my own upbringing is, first of all, my parents loved me absolutely, no question. But it still was an era where there was a lot of black and white theology, black and white ways of looking at life, children to be seen and not heard. It seemed to be this fear that unless you put really strict boundaries around your children, they will go off the rails. So so it's embedded in fear. I've got to stop my child doing that, because if I don't, then there will be this, what kind of adult will there be? So this responsibility of a parent on their shoulders of how this child is going to be when they're an adult. And unfortunately, back in the 60s particularly, we didn't talk about parenting as much, I don't think, and the way we can work with our children rather than just set rules that they have to obey. And so my upbringing, even though my parents really loved me, and it was still at times the punishment came with this sense of a moral judgment. You might have done something wrong. But then there was, but if you did that, people aren't going to trust you in the future. Now, as soon as someone says that, I'm not trustworthy, that is shameful. So even as a little girl, I remember sitting under this immense shame because, I might have stolen some money out of my mum's purse. I did. And to buy lollies at the tuck shop. And, those sorts of things. I look back at those situations and go, with some good counselling, I was a kid, I was 5, what if I no power over if they can buy lollies or not? No, they steal, but the judgment that comes over that when you're caught, and shame out of fear of, oh no, if I don't put these boundaries and stop Bella from doing that, she will become this kind of adult. But this little 5-year-old girl, she just felt incredible shame from a very young age. Then the theology of growing up in a Christian home and church, unfortunately, layers upon that. And I think that's that shame that it goes in deep at a really young age. And, sometimes you've got to pull it out and expose it for what it is. And then it loses its power and go, oh, well, yeah, I was only 5. Yeah, okay, I can see what they were doing. I don't have to believe that about myself now when I'm in my 60s.
Matthew, is there something here? Because I know we could take a long time unpacking so many dimensions here. But is there something early in our conversation for listeners who are saying, well, I have my faith in God. He's the one who promises to deliver me from shame. And how do we tap into that when we recognise that some of these things have shaped us from our childhood, through our schooling, even through our churches we've begun to touch on? Is there something here we can recognise as a key to understanding how that shame can be dealt with before God?
Yeah. Look, I think when we read the Gospels in particular, we see a lot of examples of the way Jesus engaged with people's shame. And often in our church, in society in general, but even in the church, we use shame as a means of controlling people. It's a way of forcing people to do what we want them to, because we just deeply embarrass them and make them feel bad about themselves if they don't. And that's not apparently the way that Jesus responded to the people around him. Jesus used to hang out with lepers and the outcasts, and he didn't seem to be worried about the so-called shame of being on the margins. And one story that I was reminded of just a week or so ago is when Jesus was walking with a crowd, and a woman touched his cloak, and she'd been bleeding uncontrollably for 12 years. She was deeply ashamed, and she lived on the margins of society because she was unclean. And when Jesus felt that some power went out of him and she was healed, he drew attention to her. And it's very interesting that he did in the middle of the crowd. You could see it possibly as him shaming her for the audacity of touching him. But in fact, it was the reverse. Because she was already living in shame, he wanted to draw attention to her cleanness to the crowd, to show there is no reason anymore for you to castigate this woman or to stay away from her because she's unclean. I want to make a public announcement that she is no longer to be ashamed. And the very next thing that happens in that story is that Jesus walks along because he's trying to get to Jairus's house, where the daughter of Jairus has been very sick. And the daughter, by the time he gets there, has actually died because he's been waylaid by the healing of this woman. And so when he gets to Jairus's house, they say, "Oh, don't worry, she's passed away." And he says, "No, she's just asleep." And he raises her back to life. And he says then to the people who saw her come back to life, "Do not say anything about this to anyone." And I think that was because he didn't want that little girl to grow up with the reputation of being, "Oh, she's the girl who was brought back to life," because that would have been a sense of shame on her. And so in the one context, Jesus saw that a person was living in shame and released them for it in a public space. And in another situation, he saw that there was a little girl who needed to be protected and loved and cared for without living a life of shame. And you see that repeated in so many of Jesus' interactions with people throughout his ministry, that he releases them from shame rather than controlling them by piling on more shame.
This is 2020 with Neil Johnson, helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision Christian Radio.
Well, I did say we'd be in the deep end, and you're welcome to join in our conversation today on 1-800-316-316. We're talking about shame our two special guests, Matthew C. Clarke and Isabella Rossini Clarke. They're about to front a conference coming up in early April, and it's all about shame. And I know they especially would like to talk to people who are in the sorts of ministries or positions where you're dealing with this shame, because it's going to be very, very valuable. Look, let's take some calls straight away, shall we? There's an anonymous caller calling in from Perth in WA. Hi to the caller. Welcome along.
Well, thank you very much for this morning. I believe shame affects self-image, and it has so in me. My father was a very generous man with a good sense of humour, but he had a Jekyll and Hyde side to him. I experienced quite a lot of verbal abuse growing up, which still affects me today in stressful situations. Certain others notice this about my affected self-image, and I can freeze up instead of replying when I need to. And this has happened to me even in church through embarrassment, such as Matthew mentioned, I think, to keep the church machinery ticking over, so to speak. Yeah, so that's my comment.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I'm thinking I might just go to Bella here because, self-image, as we're growing up, we don't get to choose our parents. Jekyll and Hyde dad. Any thoughts here for our caller?
Yeah, look, I hear that pain still sitting in your voice there, and I don't know your name. I know you're ringing in anonymously, but look, I feel that. I think that's one of the things when you've maybe survived some trauma and some shame yourself, you can feel that in other people. And I do hope you've got people that come beside you and help absorb some of that, because it should never have been put on you. But when it has been, that's where we can talk. If we've got people who we can talk about it, it loses its intensity, and then we can receive the mercy that we should have always had. And unfortunately, as parents, we don't always do it right. And once you understand that, I think we can be people of mercy, because we know that we unfortunately sometimes hurt other people, and they have hurt us. And that's where mercy is our breath as we walk alongside each other. So thanks for sharing that. And I do just pray that you have people who can walk beside you in that space.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to that caller. 1-800-316-316, and undoubtedly we'll touch on mercy in the way that it relates to shame as we go in our conversation. Let's take another call, though, and squeeze in this one before news. Sue is in Kingston in Tasmania. Hi, Sue. Welcome.
Hello, Ian. Neil. Hello, Neil, and Matthew and Bella. Look, I just want to thank you so much for what you've shared, because in the 90s, I was attending a conference in Wollongong, the Lighthouse Christian Church. It was the Anointing, and there was this wonderful Aboriginal preacher and healer, Pastor Rodney Minnicon, who was ministering at that conference, and he gave this amazing talk about how Australia had started with the British colonisation, and it caused a lot of fear and shame and guilt and, all of these extraordinary issues of rejection and loss and grief because of the convicts being sent out, but also because of the Aboriginal people being treated the way they were.
Need to be quick here, Sue.
Yes, sorry. So he invited people forward. I went forward to be released from the spirit of fear. And he came to me and said, I release you of the spirit of fear and shame. And you've just helped me to understand that shame to a degree that I hadn't before, because I had a perfectionist father who used to not spare the rod to spoil the child. And there was a lot of brutality.
Sue, we're nearly at news time. I need to get a comment here. And if I come to Matthew, free from shame, thoughts here quickly for Sue?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important. We'll talk a little bit more later about what do you do if you have shame? What are your options for where you go from there? And we also want to talk a little bit more about how we reduce the casting of shame onto other people, so that people can live not always without shame, but with a way that de-shames shame, so that we don't have to hide and be scared of it. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure.
I do want to give opportunity for listeners to have your say today. Let's take another call, shall we? Let's hear from Natalie, who is in Camp Mountain in Queensland. Hey, Natalie, welcome. Thanks for being patient.
Thank you, Neil and Bella and Matthew. I have a kind of comment and certainly a question. With the other two callers, I'm also in my 60s. I was brought up in the, children are seen and not heard, from parents who had suffered in the war, so no doubt there was trauma as well. It was a bit patchy, to be honest, and I still respond. If someone raises their voice, I shrink back into myself, etc., all of that. But I was just going to ask, I'm now a grandmother and we have a lot to do with our grandchildren, and often yesterday we had 3 little girls here, under 6, and I try very hard to create an atmosphere where we are all gentle and kind with each other, and we don't say nasty things, and we don't hurt each other, and we share and all that stuff. So I'm just wondering, where is the line between creating shame by guiding a child's behaviour and guiding a child's behaviour in a positive way? Because you also see, in our schools, there's all these reports about children being violent towards teachers and not respecting authority. And so where have we gone from children being seen and not heard to children ruling the roost and having no respect for authority? And where is that line when you talk about shame in the upbringing?
I think wonderful insight and sharing your story there, Natalie. And I'm thinking I go to Bella as a response here. No, Matthew. Okay, Matthew.
Yeah, we're pointing to each other here, Neil. Look, Natalie, that's an important but very tricky question. And it depends a little bit on the way you conceive of what shame actually means. And so there may well be a positive role for shame because it helps people understand what's expected of them and what's socially normal. And so shame can be used as a teaching method. Other people think of shame at that toxic end as an emotion which is always negative. And so there are differences of opinion about whether shame does have a positive role or not. And in the context of parenting, I think it's important to distinguish with your child over time in an age-appropriate way the difference between them having done something wrong and them being an awful person. And so it is important to teach our children the difference between right and wrong, from touching a hot stove to lying. There's important things for us to say, now that was wrong. You shouldn't do that. Don't do it again. That's different from saying, you're a horrible liar. To say that thing that you just said was a lie and it's not good to lie is different from saying you're a horrible liar. And so if you see your children starting to internalize and withdraw because they're starting to feel horrible about themselves, then that might be a misuse of shame.
Wonderful. Natalie, anything further to add from your end?
Yeah, I was just going to add, again, with our range of grandchildren, we have quite a few. You have the ones who are quite brazen and solid and confident, and the ones who are much more quickly hurt or look hurt and quick to cry about, little things or whatever. So that's a really fine line to walk then, isn't it? Because with one child, you can say, no, don't do that. That's really not acceptable. At Nanny's house, we don't hit your sister. Whatever, versus the child who's really sensitive and then feels really bad about everything, and that just seems to be in their nature,
Natalie, good thought there. Bella, have you got something to add there for Natalie?
Yeah, I as a grandparent who now fortnightly looks after 2 little grandchildren for a couple of days, I've been thrust into that as well. The great thing about being a grandparent, I don't feel it's my job to actually do all that disciplinary stuff. When I say I do, but I don't take the weight of that. I'm trying to build a fairly gentle relationship with my grandchildren because I don't see them very often. But I think what I'm trying to build in with them is that they are loved, that they are cherished, and just looking to see the good in them and to always be drawing that out. Like, if they're going to hit each other, what's going on for you that you feel cranky today? You're obviously a bit cranky and miserable. So can we talk about that? Try to get down beneath the behavior. And as a grandparent, I feel like, wow, I've possibly got the opportunity to go into those spaces. I know as a parent, I was too busy parenting to think about that. And I probably didn't even understand that time in parenting, not time out parenting style. So I guess if you go into those spaces and you keep communicating and getting the kids to think about their feelings and their emotions, why are they doing what they're doing? What's going on for them? I don't think that's indulging them. I think that's getting them to help stay connected to their feelings, connected to their behaviours. And so I'm personally concentrating on that sort of thing as a grandparent, because I think that's more likely to be less shameful.
Wonderful. Natalie.
I can still be firm.
Still be firm, but you're mindful of what causes shame. Natalie, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316 to join in our conversation. And it's all very well to stay around some personal issues here and the sort of shame that we all experience, because shame impacts everyone. Either you're receiving and sometimes you're actually causing or giving that shame. But let me take us into the deep end here around this issue of deep shame that sometimes arises from when you've been traumatised in your younger years. I come to you, Matthew. What do we understand about deep shame and the effects it has on us?
Yes, as you say, there's a close connection between trauma and shame. And so people who undergo some personal trauma, whether it's the death of someone important to them, whether it's a severe car accident, whether they're working in military situations, whether they've been in jail, whether they've done something themselves that is deeply violent against somebody else. There's so many areas of trauma in our society. And trauma often leaves a fingerprint of shame. And that applies to both the victims and the perpetrators. So if you think of a situation like domestic violence, where, let's say, a wife is being physically and emotionally abused by her husband, and sometimes it happens the other way around, and sometimes it happens in same-sex couples as well. But let's just take that stereotypical approach of a wife who is being mistreated by a husband. They can often feel deeply ashamed of themselves because they've been told repeatedly that they're useless and that it's their fault that they're being beaten because they did something wrong. And so the trauma of what's been done to them can turn them in several different directions. And I wanted to just mention a simple tool called the compass of shame. And people who are feeling that sort of deep shame, that worthlessness, can sometimes turn to withdrawal. They go quiet. They run and hide. That's one response. Another is to try to avoid the things that shame them, just to deny that it happened, or to fill up their life with some other addiction to mask the shame that they feel. A third way is to start attacking yourself, to be so down on yourself, to start abusing yourself because you think you're worthless and you only deserve to be hurt, so you start hurting yourself. And then a fourth way is to attack others, to turn that shame outward into self-protection and defensiveness, and to then act out and blame the people who have been hurting you. Now, all of those ways can help. They can help you survive, but none of them are terribly productive in the long term or healthy. And so the other way beyond those 4 points of the compass is to bring the shame to the surface and to talk about it, to not allow it to fester inside in the hidden shadows, but to accept it yourself and to find some forum, some people, some way that you can shine a light on it. And then quite often it loses some of its power. That same sort of dynamic also works with the perpetrators, the person who beats their wife. They also carry a lot of shame. And we might talk a bit later about the work Bella and I do in human trafficking. And it's not just the victims of human trafficking, but the traffickers who carry some shame that has to be dealt with somehow, to release them so that they can repent and change, be transformed into something better, to become their best person. You somehow have to overcome shame in that context as well.
Sometimes we make a reference to the thief on the cross and Jesus' response to him. No doubt that's a shame-driven response as well. Let's come back to Jesus, because there must be real benefits for us as Christian believers, for those of us who are introduced to knowing God, seeing Jesus' example and having this wonderful example and seeing what he does to deal with our shame. Can we come back to some more of those examples that we might be able to see from the scriptures? Because I know that there'll be listeners who are saying, I need something timeless here. I need something that's going to really show me the heart of God when it comes to the shame. So I come to Matthew or Bella? Matthew.
Yep. I think there's such a wealth of examples in the scriptures, and particularly in the Gospels, because we see Jesus, who we believe to be God, the visible face of the invisible God. And Jesus says that we should be merciful as our Father is merciful. And so mercy is something that is a really central concept for anyone who's trying to follow in the way of Jesus. And shame is something that often gets in the way of mercy. Shame can prevent people from receiving mercy, and shame can also prevent people from showing mercy. And Jesus, in showing mercy to people from the heart of God, often has to somehow work around people's existing shame and somehow has to show them mercy without them feeling that they're so indebted that they inherit some new shame. An interesting example, I think, is Peter's denial of Jesus. So you might recall at the end of Jesus' life, while he was on trial, Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times and then felt deep shame that he had done so. And then Jesus was killed on the cross, and 3 days later returned. And sometime later, John, in the Gospel of John, it reports that Jesus made some breakfast with some fish for his disciples who were out fishing. And he had a talk to Peter on the beach and said to Peter, "Do you love me?" And in this threefold question that Jesus asked Peter, we see Jesus reinstating Peter to help Peter get over his shame of the threefold denial. It's a fascinating story that there is deep shame when we betray someone. But Jesus shows a way of saying the betrayal is not the end of the story. There is a way out. There's a way for you to be restored to your rightful place in God's lap, in God's warm, loving embrace, and a way for you to be restored to yourself, restored to the confidence that you are a valued person.
There's so many dimensions here, denial and betrayal, as you so beautifully illustrate there, Jesus and his reinstatement of Peter there. I can't help but think of that other example of the woman who was caught in adultery, and perhaps there's even a broader application here of how Jesus deals with shame, because perhaps we can talk about that in relation to sexual sin or sexuality and the way that people feel. I mean, there's some objective things and there's some very subjective things in here. But Bella, let me come to you in this, because this is a beautiful example, Jesus and the way he deals with this woman. I wonder if you've got some thoughts here around shame.
Yeah, this is one of my favourite passages, actually. So, because I think it certainly shows me that Jesus was less worried about our gender, our sin, our sexuality, all of those things than we probably are. You know, Jesus had no problem standing in that space with the woman caught in adultery, and he stood beside her. I think that's really, really important. We don't know what he was fiddling around in the sand drawing there, but we know that he was right with her. And And so that was just in that's really special. And I think it's really interesting that when he said to the Pharisees and the Sadducees that all, and imagine it probably in a circle around them with their rocks in their hands. And he said, well, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. And I imagine like everything went silent and everyone just stood there. And then they slowly, one by one, turned away and wandered off. And the thing that I love about the way Jesus reinstated the woman there when he said, look, no one here has judged you and nor do I. But also encouraged her that you don't have to live this way. There's another way to live. Go and live a different way. But they haven't in the end actually shamed you, and nor do I. And I think what's really interesting is Jesus gave all those Sadducees and Pharisees a chance, even with that question about her and her shame. Something in their heart must have had a revelation or that moment of insight to say, well, I'm not without sin. Right. Well, I can't cast the stone, and walked away. Now, we don't know how those stories ended. But Jesus, in that one statement, reinstated the woman, and so she didn't have to feel ashamed, but gave those other people who are in judgment a chance to see themselves a different way as well as her. So I think Jesus is incredibly profound with the way he deals with being directive and showing us a different way to live, but without causing more shame. In fact, he lifts it off so we have a chance to be something to be revealed in our own mind and our hearts. Quite amazing.
So there's a personal level, and you might even fit yourself into the story, and no doubt there'll be listeners who see themselves in the story. And that personal level of acceptance, putting yourself in the shoes of Jesus and how you deal with some of these sorts of issues as they come up in your own life. There's also different levels, no doubt, as well. So for the priest or the pastor in the pulpit, defending the character of God, there's going to be some feelings of shame as they represent a godly truth. And no doubt even then taking that to a whole new level again, people who are in the legislature who are looking to bring harmony, even then there's sort of a positive peer pressure that's created with the formation of laws that try and bring a harmony to a nation. And I wish we had lots of time to unpack some of those things, but we don't, and we're running out of time actually. Let me ask you, Matthew, those people who deal with deep issues of shame, the sorts of people who might be on the front lines, people like prison chaplains, people who might be counsellors and pastors, these are the sorts of people I know that you'd love to connect with as well. What sort of benefit is there in this conference that's coming up in April for people who are on the front line and dealing with this sort of thing to be able to glean some of these things more deeply in a conference setting? Any thoughts here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the conference is a bit of a hybrid. It's the first day of the conference is open to anybody. So any of your listeners who are in Sydney and want to come to the North Shore for the northern beaches for Sunday the 7th are welcome, and the website says more about that. But then the second, third and fourth day is, as you say, Neil, specifically for people who are working in this space where they help others with shame, or they would like, there may be students or they're wanting to work in that space. And the workshop there for 3 days will be led by some people from the UK who've specialised in helping offenders in jail deal with their shame. But the things they've learned from that context are broadly applicable to outside correctional services, to people involved in counselling, chaplaincy work, people working in education with troubled children, people working with Indigenous people living in trauma. And so part of the skills there will be to add a shame dimension to a trauma-informed approach. So a lot of people and organisations talk about having a trauma-informed approach. That's aware of the effects of trauma on victims. And what this conference will do at both a conceptual and a practical level is give people further skills beyond just being trauma-informed to understand the role that shame might play for people who are traumatised and how to help them through that.
Well, I know the two of you work in areas of prevention of human trafficking, so there are many more dimensions to both of you. And the book that you've written together, Disrupting Mercy, The Gift of Extreme Kindness, Motivated by Compassion. And beautiful to be able to get some insights today into shame. And just for listeners, the last time we spoke, and yes, there'll be a podcast that can be easily accessed on the Vision app or on the Vision website, where you'll be able to find a conversation we had a short while back, late last year, I think it was, around mercy. And just to get into the deep end on some of these things, and I know that there'll be some listeners just desperate to get a hold of some more information. So let me just point listeners to how they can connect with you. Matthew C. Clarke and Isabella Rossini Clarke. There is a website. It's turningteardropsintojoy.com. turningteardropsintojoy.com. And I know that Matthew and Bella are very happy for you to connect, send some messages. You might be able to interact in some ways around the issue. And the Conversations with Shame conference, it's not far away, 7th to the 10th of April. And as Matthew said, giving participants insight into the dynamics of shame from multiple perspectives. Two things happening: a one-day symposium on the 7th of April, then day 2 and 3, a workshop for practitioners who help others deal with shame. It has been a great conversation today, and I want to thank our two guests, Matthew and Bella. I appreciate you taking some time to share your thoughts and your heart with our listeners today on 2020.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. And if any of your listeners have further questions, please get in touch with us. We'd love to talk about it.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.